Welcome, weary traveller, to another journey through the whispers of history. As you settle in for a restful slumber, I invite you to ponder for a moment. Where in the world are you nestled right now, listening to these gentle musings? And what time of day or night has found you seeking solace in these tales? Do share in the comments below, for there is a certain magic in knowing that, across the globe, others are drifting off to these same stories, carried by the currents of curiosity into the realm of dreams. If you find yourself soothed by these quiet excursions through the annals of history, I encourage you to subscribe so that you may embark on many more adventures together. Tonight, we find ourselves transported to a world both distant and familiar, the cobblestone streets and candlelit chambers of medieval Europe. An age of chivalry and castles, of plagues and superstitions, where life was fleeting and often fraught with challenges. But for those who bore the added burden of disability, the trials of this time were amplified tenfold. In a society where survival hinged on physical labour and conformity, to be handicapped was to be cast to the margins, left to navigate a world that had little understanding or empathy for those who were different. As we explore this poignant chapter of human history, we will meet individuals who defied the odds, who left their mark on the world despite the immense obstacles they faced. We will delve into the shifting perceptions of disability, from the spiritual to the scientific, and consider how far we have come and how far we have yet to go. So allow yourself to sink deeper into your pillow, to let the weight of the day dissolve into the warmth of your bed. For the next little while, you are a traveller through time, bearing witness to the resilience and resolve of those who came before. And as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you will carry with you a newfound appreciation for the simple gifts of accessibility and understanding that we so often take for granted. Let us begin our journey in the early Middle Ages, a time when the concept of disability was inextricably linked to the spiritual realm. In a world where medical knowledge was scarce and superstition reigned supreme, those with physical or mental impairments were often viewed through a lens of religious mysticism. To the medieval mind, a disability could be interpreted as a sign of divine punishment, a mark of sin, or moral failing. The Bible itself contained passages that seemed to reinforce this notion, such as the story of Jesus healing the blind man, where his disciples ask, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" But disability was also sometimes seen as a test of faith, an opportunity for the afflicted to demonstrate their devotion and for others to practice charity. The Catholic Church taught that caring for the sick and infirm was a Christian duty, a means of securing one's place in heaven. These competing views of disability as punishment or as a path to piety created a complex and often contradictory societal stance. On one hand, those with disabilities were frequently marginalized, mocked, and mistreated. On the other, they were occasionally elevated as objects of charity and even reverence. One common belief was that the disabled were closer to God, their suffering a kind of holy affliction. This led to the veneration of certain disabled individuals as saints or mystics, such as the blind Italian poet and theologian, Blessed Jacopo da Todi, who was said to have miraculous gifts of prophecy and healing. However, for the vast majority of disabled people in the Middle Ages, life was far from saintly. The most common disabling conditions of the time were often met with fear and revulsion rather than reverence. Leprosy, for instance, was among the most dreaded diseases of the era. Highly contagious and disfiguring, it was seen as a curse from God, a punishment for sin. Lepers were cast out of society, forced to wear distinguishing clothing and carry bells to warn others of their approach. They were confined to leper colonies on the outskirts of towns, forbidden to interact with the healthy population. Blindness, too, was a common affliction, often caused by malnutrition, injury, or untreated infections. Without access to education or accommodations, the blind were largely relegated to begging or dependent on family support. In a world where literacy was rare even among the sighted, the inability to read or write was an immense barrier. Other disabling conditions abounded: palsy, epilepsy, deafness, intellectual disabilities, each carrying its own stigma and challenges. The medieval mind, steeped in superstition, often attributed these conditions to demonic possession or witchcraft. The disabled were thus doubly burdened, struggling not only with the physical limitations of their condition, but also the social ostracism and suspicion it engendered. To bring these struggles to life, let us consider the story of Mega Hildebrandt, a real woman who lived in the 14th century Germany. Born with a twisted foot, Mega was relegated to the margins of her village from a young age. Unable to work in the fields or marry, she relied on the grudging charity of her neighbours to survive. In court records from 1365, we find a poignant account of Mega's plight. She is called before the magistrate, accused by villagers of being a witch. They claim that her disability is proof of her unholy alliance, that she uses her twisted foot to stomp the devil's mark in the dirt. Mega pleads her innocence, her voice shaking as she recounts a lifetime of ostracism and abuse. She tells of being pelted with stones by children, of being denied even the meagre comfort of human touch. In the end, the magistrate dismisses the charges, finding no evidence of witchcraft. But for Mega, the damage is done. The accusation itself is a painful reminder of her place in society. Mega's story is a microcosm of the daily indignities and challenges faced by disabled people in the Middle Ages. In a world without accommodations or accessibility, every task was an uphill battle. A simple trip to the market or church could be an ordeal, navigating treacherous cobblestone streets with a crutch or cane. Most buildings were inaccessible to those with mobility issues, their narrow doorways and steep stairs an insurmountable obstacle. For the disabled poor, which was the vast majority, life was a constant struggle for survival. With no social safety net or disability benefits, they were forced to rely on begging or the support of family members. Many ended up in almshouses or hospitals run by the church, which provided basic food and shelter, but little in the way of dignity or autonomy. Even within these institutions, the disabled were often segregated and mistreated. In her book, Disability in Medieval Europe, historian Irina Metzler describes how residents of almshouses were required to adhere to strict rules and routines, their daily lives regimented by religious authorities. They were frequently subjected to moral judgment and condescension, their disabilities seen as a mark of spiritual failing. For disabled women, the challenges were even greater. In a society where a woman's worth was largely tied to her ability to bear children and run a household, a disability could be a sentence to lifelong dependence and poverty. Disabled women were often seen as a burden on their families, unable to fulfill their prescribed roles. We see this dynamic play out in the story of Alda Müller, a blind woman from 15th century Switzerland. In court records from 1471, Alda's brother petitions to have her removed from his household, claiming that she is a drain on his resources. He argues that as a blind woman, Alda is unable to contribute to the family income, and thus does not deserve support. Alda, for her part, pleads to stay, promising to earn her keep through spinning and weaving. But her brother is unmoved, and the court ultimately sides with him. Alda is sent to the local almshouse where she will spend the rest of her days in isolation and dependence. These glimpses into the lives of Mega and Alda offer a sobering reminder of the immense challenges faced by disabled women in the Middle Ages. But even amidst the struggles and hardships, there are glimmers of humanity and resilience that shine through the historical record. Take, for instance, the incredible story of Teresa de Cartagena, a 15th century Spanish nun who became the first known deaf woman to write a book. Born into a wealthy converso family, Teresa lost her hearing as a young woman, likely due to illness. In a letter to a friend, she describes the anguish of her condition, writing, "Deafness is a living death, a death in which there is still life." But rather than succumbing to despair, Teresa turned to her faith for solace and purpose. She joined a Cistercian convent and began writing spiritual texts, using her experience of deafness as a metaphor for the soul's journey towards God. Her most famous work, Grove of the Infirm, is a meditation on the power of suffering to bring one closer to the divine. In a passage that encapsulates her remarkable perspective, Teresa writes, "I realized that the trials which I felt to be my tomb were in fact a door through which one enters into the spacious house of divine mercy." For Teresa, her disability was not a punishment or a curse, but a path to enlightenment, a way of accessing a deeper understanding of the human condition. Teresa's story is a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most daunting of challenges. But it is also a reminder of how rare such stories are in the historical record. For every Teresa de Cartagena who managed to leave a mark on history, there were countless disabled people whose lives went unrecorded and unremembered. This is especially true for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, the disabled peasants and serfs who made up the vast majority of the population. For them, a disability was not just a physical impairment, but a sentence to a life of grinding poverty and hardship. Without access to education or skilled trades, disabled peasants were largely relegated to begging or subsistence labour. Many ended up as itinerant wanderers, moving from village to village in search of alms and charity. In some cases, they formed their own communities on the margins of society, banding together for support and survival. We catch a glimpse of this world in the story of Martin, a disabled beggar from 14th century England. In a court record from 1320, Martin is accused of theft after being caught rummaging through a rubbish heap outside a manor house. In his defense, Martin explains that he was simply searching for scraps of food and clothing, as he has no other means of support. The court, in a rare display of leniency, ultimately acquits Martin, but not before admonishing him to go forth and beg more diligently. For Martin and countless others like him, begging was not a choice but a necessity, the only means of survival in a world that had no place for them. But while the lives of disabled peasants were marked by unrelenting hardship, those at the other end of the social spectrum often fared little better. For disabled nobles and royalty, their high status could be both a blessing and a curse, offering them access to resources and accommodations, but also subjecting them to intense scrutiny and judgment. Consider the case of King Charles VI of France, who ruled in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Charles was known as the Mad, a reference to the bouts of psychosis and delusion that plagued him throughout his reign. At times he would forget his own name and title, insisting that he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. Charles's condition was a source of great concern and instability for the French court. His erratic behaviour and inability to govern consistently led to power struggles and intrigues among his advisors and family members. At one point, his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, even took over as regent during one of his prolonged episodes. But despite the immense challenges posed by Charles's mental illness, he was never deposed or removed from power. As a king, his divine right to rule was seen as inviolable, even in the face of obvious incapacity. This points to a key difference in how disability was perceived and treated among the noble classes. For a peasant, a disability was often seen as a mark of moral failing or divine punishment. But for a noble or royal, it could be framed as a test of character, an opportunity to demonstrate strength and resilience in the face of adversity. This is not to say that disabled nobles had it easy. Far from it. But their social status did afford them certain protections and privileges that were denied to the lower classes. We see this dynamic play out in the story of Ercole d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara in the late 15th century. Ercole was known as the Lame, a reference to the deformed leg he had from birth. Despite his physical limitation, Ercole was a skilled horseman and military leader, renowned for his prowess on the battlefield. In a letter to his son, Ercole advises him to never let his disability hold him back, writing, "Do not think that because of my bad leg, I am worth less than the others." Ercole's words reflect a certain nobility ethos of the time, that a physical impairment was no barrier to greatness, as long as one had the strength of character to overcome it. But while Ercole's story is one of triumph over adversity, it is also a reminder of the immense privilege that made such a triumph possible. For a disabled peasant, the idea of leading troops into battle or governing a duchy would have been unthinkable. Their lot was one of unrelenting toil and struggle, with little hope of escape or advancement. This divide between the noble and peasant experience of disability is perhaps nowhere more stark than in the realm of warfare. In the Middle Ages, war was a constant fact of life, with armies clashing on battlefields across Europe and the Holy Land. For the knights and nobles who led these armies, war was a path to glory and honour. But for the common foot soldiers, it was a brutal and often short-lived existence. Warfare in the Middle Ages was a bloody and protracted affair, with battles often lasting for hours or even days. Soldiers were equipped with an array of weapons designed to maim and kill: swords, axes, maces, and bows. Injuries were common and often gruesome, with soldiers suffering from deep cuts, crushed limbs, and penetrating wounds. For those who survived the initial injury, the outlook was often grim. Medieval medicine was primitive at best, with little understanding of infection or proper wound care. Many soldiers died of sepsis or gangrene, their wounds festering and rotting in the days and weeks after the battle. Those who did survive were often left with permanent disabilities, missing limbs, paralysis, blindness, or disfigurement. In a society where physical labour was the primary means of livelihood, such injuries could be a death sentence, leaving soldiers unable to work or support themselves. We see this harsh reality reflected in the story of Thomas Hostel, an English archer who fought in the 100 Years' War. In a petition to the king in 1375, Thomas describes how he was maimed in the king's war, losing the use of his right hand and arm. Unable to practice his trade as an archer, Thomas was reduced to begging for alms, his once proud status as a soldier now a distant memory. Thomas's story was all too common in the Middle Ages, with countless soldiers returning from war broken and destitute. But even amidst this grim reality, there were glimmers of humanity and compassion. In some cases, wounded soldiers were taken in by monasteries or charitable institutions where they could receive basic care and support. One such institution was the Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London, which was founded in the 12th century to care for the sick and infirm. Among its residents were many disabled veterans, including a group of blind archers who had lost their sight in the King's Wars. These men were provided with food, shelter, and a small stipend, a recognition of their sacrifice and service. But while institutions like St. Bartholomew's offered a modicum of support for disabled veterans, they were the exception rather than the rule. For most soldiers, the end of their military service marked the beginning of a life of poverty and hardship, with little hope of relief or redemption. This was especially true for those who fought in the Crusades, the series of religious wars that pitted Christian Europe against the Muslim powers of the Middle East. For the Crusaders who set out to conquer the Holy Land, the promise of spiritual salvation was often overshadowed by the grim realities of war and disease. Many Crusaders fell victim to the harsh desert climate and lack of proper sanitation, succumbing to dysentery, malaria, and other diseases. Others were wounded in battle, their injuries often aggravated by the long journey home. Those who did make it back often found themselves in a state of physical and spiritual crisis, their faith tested by the horrors they had witnessed. We see this struggle play out in the story of Girard de Ridefort, a French knight who fought in the Third Crusade. Girard was gravely wounded in the siege of Acre, his leg shattered by a catapult stone. After a grueling journey home, he found himself a broken man, his once powerful body now a source of constant pain and limitation. In a letter to his wife, Girard describes his anguish, writing, "I, who was once a warrior for Christ, am now a cripple, a burden to myself and others." Girard's words reflect the profound sense of disillusionment and despair that many crusaders felt upon returning home. For them, the glory of the crusade had given way to the grim reality of life with a disability. But even as the Crusades took their toll on the bodies and minds of European soldiers, they also had a profound impact on the societies they left behind, the constant flow of wounded un. As the 14th century drew to a close, the Black Death had left an indelible mark on the medieval world. This catastrophic pandemic, which claimed the lives of millions, spared no one, rich or poor, able-bodied or disabled. In its wake, it left a society grappling with profound questions about the nature of illness, misfortune, and the very meaning of life itself. For centuries, disability had been viewed primarily through a spiritual lens. Those with physical or mental impairments were often seen as being punished by God for their sins or the sins of their ancestors. They were the recipients of divine judgment, their afflictions a visible sign of moral failure. This belief was so entrenched that many disabled people themselves internalized it, viewing their own bodies and minds with shame and self-loathing. But as the plague raged on, indiscriminately striking down the pious and the wicked alike, cracks began to form in this long-held worldview. After all, if the Black Death was a punishment from God, why then did it claim the lives of so many devout priests and nuns? Why did it ravage the bodies of innocent children? Slowly, a new perspective began to emerge, one that saw illness and disability not as divine retribution, but as a natural part of the human experience. This shift in thinking was gradual, of course. Old beliefs and superstitions died hard in the medieval world, but as the years passed, more and more people began to question the idea that disability was a mark of spiritual failing. They looked to the natural world for answers, seeking to understand the causes of impairment through the lens of science and medicine. One of the earliest advocates of this new perspective was a French surgeon named Guy de Chauliac. Born in the early 14th century, de Chauliac was a pioneering figure in the field of medicine. He studied at the prestigious University of Bologna, where he learned the latest techniques in surgery and anatomy. But it was his experience treating the victims of the Black Death that would ultimately shape his views on disability. As the plague swept through France, de Chauliac found himself on the front lines of the crisis. He worked tirelessly to care for the sick and dying, using his surgical skills to lance boils and drain pustules. But he also witnessed firsthand the devastating toll that the disease took on the human body. Many of those who survived the plague were left with permanent disabilities, blindness, paralysis, disfigurement. Rather than seeing these impairments as a sign of moral failing, however, de Chauliac viewed them as a natural consequence of illness. He argued that disability was not a punishment from God, but rather a result of physical or mental trauma. This was a radical idea for the time, one that challenged centuries of religious dogma. In his most famous work, the Chirurgia Magna, de Chauliac laid out his views on disability and its treatment. He argued that disabled people deserved compassion and care, not judgment and scorn. He advocated for the use of prosthetics and other assistive devices to help those with impairments lead fuller lives. and he emphasized the importance of preventing disability through good hygiene and public health measures. De Chauliac's ideas were ahead of his time, and they did not gain widespread acceptance during his lifetime. But they planted a seed that would slowly take root over the coming centuries. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, more and more people began to embrace a scientific understanding of disability. They saw impairment not as a mark of divine disfavor, but as a natural variation in the human experience. Of course, this shift in perspective did not happen overnight. Nor was it a panacea for the many challenges that disabled people faced in the medieval world. Even as scientific understanding advanced, social stigma and discrimination remained rampant. Disabled people continued to face barriers to education, employment, and full participation in society. But the seeds that were planted in the late Middle Ages would eventually bear fruit. In the centuries that followed, disabled people would fight for their rights and dignity, demanding to be treated as full and equal members of society. They would form their own communities and organizations, advocating for themselves and for future generations. And as they did so, they would look back on figures like Guy de Chauliac as early pioneers in the struggle for disability rights. They would see in his words and actions a glimmer of the kind of world they were fighting to create. A world in which disability was not a source of shame or stigma, but a natural and valued part of the human experience. Today, we still have a long way to go in achieving that vision. Disabled people continue to face discrimination, poverty, and marginalization in societies around the world. But as we look back on the long and often painful history of disability, we can draw strength and inspiration from those who came before us. From the disabled people of the medieval world who fought against incredible odds to live with dignity and purpose, and from the allies and advocates who stood beside them, working to build a more just and inclusive society. Their legacy reminds us that progress is possible, even in the darkest of times. And it calls us to carry on their work, to keep pushing forward towards a world in which every person, regardless of ability or impairment, is valued and embraced as a full and equal member of the human family. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us hold that vision in our hearts. Let us dream of a world in which disability is not a barrier, but a source of pride and strength. A world in which every person has the support and resources they need to thrive. A world in which the voices of disabled people are heard and heeded, their experiences honored and valued. It is a vision that may seem distant at times, but it is one worth fighting for. And as we do so, we can take comfort in the knowledge that we are not alone. We stand on the shoulders of giants, of the disabled people and allies throughout history who have paved the way for us. Their courage and resilience light the path ahead, guiding us towards a brighter, more inclusive future. So let us rest now, secure in the knowledge that change is possible, that no matter how dark the night may seem, dawn is always waiting on the horizon, and that together we have the power to build a world in which every person, in all their beautiful diversity, can live with dignity, love with abandon, and dream without limit. Good night, dear listeners. May your dreams be filled with hope and possibility, and may you wake tomorrow ready to take up the torch and carry on the work of those who came before us. The road ahead may be long, but with each step we take, we move closer to a world in which disability is not a burden, but a gift, a source of strength, wisdom, and grace that enriches us all. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the very fabric of European society was unraveling. The Black Death had decimated the population, claiming rich and poor, able-bodied and disabled alike. In the wake of such devastating loss, old beliefs and superstitions began to falter. The once unshakable faith that disability was a mark of divine punishment or demonic possession started to give way to a more complex understanding. Amidst the chaos and sorrow, a quiet but significant shift was taking place. The Church, long the arbiter of all things spiritual and moral, found its authority challenged by the rise of a new class of thinkers, the early scientists and physicians. These men, driven by curiosity and reason, began to study the human body not as a mystical vessel, but as a physical machine, subject to the laws of nature. One such pioneer was the French surgeon Guy de Chauliac. Born in the early 14th century, Chauliac rose to become the personal physician to 3 popes. But it was his groundbreaking work in the field of surgery that would leave the most enduring mark. In his magnum opus, Chirurgia Magna, Chauliac meticulously detailed various surgical procedures, including treatments for disabling injuries and deformities. Chauliac's approach was revolutionary for its time. Rather than attributing disability to sin or curses, he sought to understand and treat the underlying physical causes. His work described the use of rudimentary prosthetics, such as a wooden hand for amputees and braces for those with spinal deformities. While crude by modern standards, these devices represented a crucial first step towards improving the lives of the disabled. But Chauliac was not alone in this endeavour. Across Europe, a handful of forward-thinking individuals were beginning to challenge the prevailing notions of disability. In England, the philanthropic efforts of wealthy merchants like Richard Whittington led to the establishment of almshouses and hospitals specifically for the care of the disabled and infirm. These institutions, though small in scale, provided a modicum of comfort and dignity to those who had long been shunned by society. One such beneficiary was Thomas, a former soldier who had lost his leg in the 100 Years' War. For years, Thomas had been reduced to begging on the streets of London, his once proud bearing worn down by hunger and despair. But with the opening of Whittington's almshouse, Thomas found a safe haven. He was given a bed, regular meals, and even a crude wooden crutch to aid his mobility. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. Yet even as these early seeds of change were being sown, the harsh realities of medieval life continued to bear down on the disabled. The vast majority still faced a daily struggle for survival, their lives marked by poverty, isolation, and constant physical pain. The road to true acceptance and inclusivity would be a long and arduous one, stretching far beyond the confines of the Middle Ages. As the sun began to set on this tumultuous era, the disabled of Europe could only dream of a brighter future. A future where they would be seen not as burdens or pariahs, but as human beings, worthy of compassion and respect. It would take centuries of struggle and sacrifice to make that dream a reality, but the first tentative steps had been taken. In the fading light of the medieval world, the story of disability was far from over. It was a story of resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity, of quiet dignity amidst the clamour of superstition and fear. And though the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, one thing was clear. The disabled would not be silent. They would continue to fight, to persevere, to leave their mark on history, no matter the odds. As we look back on this distant era, it is easy to feel a sense of relief, even superiority, at how far we have come. But we must not forget the lessons of the past. The struggle for equality and inclusion is an ongoing one, requiring constant vigilance and compassion. It is up to us to carry forward the torch of progress, to ensure that the mistakes of history are not repeated. So let us remember the disabled of the Middle Ages, their struggles, their triumphs, their unbreakable spirit. Let us honour their memory by building a world where no one is left behind, where every person, regardless of ability, is valued and embraced. For in the end, we are all part of the same human tapestry, woven together by the threads of history and hope. As you drift off to sleep, carry with you the words of the blind poet John Audible, who wrote in the 15th century, Though I am blind, I am not mute. Though my body is weak, my spirit is strong. May his courage and resilience be a guiding light for us all, illuminating the path to a more just and compassionate world. And so, as the sun set on another harsh day in the Middle Ages, the town beggar hobbled back to his meagre shelter, a crude lean-to hastily constructed against the outer wall of the village church. His twisted leg and hunched back clearly marked him as one of life's unfortunates in the eyes of his fellow villagers. As he settled onto his thin straw pallet, his stomach growling from yet another day of meagre scraps and crumbs, he couldn't help but reflect on the profound unfairness of his lot in life. Like so many others burdened with a disability in this unforgiving age, he had been cast to the very fringe of society, doomed to a pitiful existence relying on the fickle mercy and charity of others. He thought back to his earliest memories, flashes of a carefree childhood, running and playing with the other village children. But that was before the fever struck, leaving him permanently weakened and malformed. From that day forward, his life had taken a cruel turn. His parents, simple peasant folk, already struggling to feed their brood, hadn't known what to do with a child who couldn't pull his weight in the fields or the workshop. They loved him, he knew that, but love didn't fill hungry bellies. Reluctantly, with heavy hearts and tears in their eyes, they had sent him out to beg at the tender age of just 7 summers. "Go with God, my son," his father had said in a choked whisper, pressing a small wooden cross into his palm before turning away, his shoulders shaking with grief. His mother couldn't even meet his eyes as she placed a meagre sack with a crust of bread and a flimsy blanket over his shoulder. That had been the last time he'd felt the warmth of his mother's embrace or heard the deep rumble of his father's voice. From that day forward, the unforgiving streets had been his home and begging his sole trade. As he shifted uncomfortably on his crude bed, his joints aching from the perpetual dampness, the beggar pondered the great unfairness of a world that cast aside the weak and the broken. Weren't all men supposedly created in God's image? Why then did the Almighty allow some of his children to suffer so? It was a question that had haunted him all his life, through countless cold nights and hungry days. Oh, he had pled to the heavens for answers, for mercy, for some small glimmer of hope or respite. On his knees in front of the towering church doors, tears streaking down his grimy cheeks, he had begged God to heal him, to make him whole again, so he could live as a normal man. But if the Lord heard his desperate prayers, he gave no sign. The beggar remained trapped in his twisted, broken body, forever dependent on the pity of others. And pity was a fickle thing indeed. He'd quickly learned that most folks, even those who considered themselves good Christians, preferred to avert their eyes when they passed his outstretched alms bowl. It was as if his deformity was somehow contagious, as if by acknowledging his existence they might be tainted by his misfortune. Oh, some were kind enough. The plump baker's wife who always saved him the end pieces of her loaves, the old widower who pressed a coin into his palm with a sad, knowing smile. But for every act of kindness, there were a dozen cruelties. He shuddered, remembering the gang of drunken youths who had mocked him, calling him a monster, pelting him with rotten vegetables until he cowered in the gutter, or the sour-faced priest who had scolded him for his sloth and shooed him away from the church steps like a mangy dog, as if he had chosen this wretched existence. No. Life for a disabled beggar in these times was a brutal, merciless affair. Each day was a desperate fight for survival, an endless cycle of hunger, cold, and scorn. There were no houses of healing to ease his suffering, no gentle monks to offer him sanctuary and solace. He was utterly alone in the world, with only his faith in a better life after death to sustain him through the bleakest hours. As he lay there, every bone weary, the beggar could feel the familiar tendrils of despair curling around his battered heart. How much longer could he endure such an empty, anguished existence? Part of him longed for the release of death, for the chance to shuffle off his mortal coil and find peace at long last. But even in the depths of his misery, there remained a stubborn spark of life, an ember of determination that wouldn't let him surrender. Broken and battered though he wasn't ready to yield to the darkness just yet. Come morning light, he would drag himself up once more, take his place outside the church doors, and raise his trembling hands in supplication. For what else could he do? This was the only life he had ever known, the only path left to one such as him in this cruel and uncaring world. And so, like a reed bending before the storm, he would endure. Day by day, scrap by measly scrap, he would cling to his meagre existence, praying that in the next life, if not in this one, he might finally know a measure of peace and dignity. As sleep finally claimed him, the beggar dreamt of a world he had never known, a world where mercy and compassion reigned, where even the lowest and most broken of men were treated with kindness and respect. It was a beautiful dream, a fleeting glimpse of a heaven he still hoped to one day see. But as the first pale fingers of dawn crept across the horizon, the beautiful vision faded, replaced by the all-too-familiar ache of an empty belly and the distant toll of the church bells, calling the faithful to prayer. With a heavy sigh, the beggar reached for his rough-hewn crutch and struggled to his feet once more. It was time to greet another day, in the only way he knew how, with quiet fortitude and an unwavering faith that somehow, in some form, deliverance might one day come. And so the cycle began anew, as it did every morning, as it would continue to do until the merciful hand of fate finally chose to intervene. Until that distant day, the disabled and the downtrodden of the Middle Ages would keep clinging to their ember of hope, keep enduring in a world that had no place for them, keep dreaming of a kinder, brighter tomorrow, even as the cold reality of their existence pressed in from every side. It was a hard lot, a cruel and thankless one, but it was the only lot they had ever known. And in the face of such adversity, such unimaginable hardship, their quiet resilience was nothing short of extraordinary. Theirs was a song of survival, of the indomitable nature of the human spirit, and it echoed through the ages, a testament to the strength and courage of those history so often forgot. So the next time you find yourself complaining about some petty modern inconvenience, take a moment to remember the disabled beggars of the Middle Ages, those forgotten souls who endured more in a single day than most of us could fathom in a lifetime. Remember their struggles, their quiet bravery in the face of a world that had no mercy for them. And in that remembrance, perhaps we can all find a little more compassion, a little more gratitude for the blessings we so often take for granted. For in the end, are we not all simply travelers on this mortal coil, each grappling with our own burdens and challenges? Perhaps if we could see each other through the eyes of that humble beggar, eyes that looked past surface differences to the shared humanity beneath, the world might be a kinder, gentler place. It is a simple lesson, but a profound one, and it is one we would do well to carry with us as we navigate the trials and triumphs of our own lives. For in the end, no matter our station or circumstance, we are all united by the common threads of hope, of resilience, of the undying human impulse to endure and overcome. And it is in that unity, that recognition of our shared struggle and our shared strength, that we might finally begin to build a world that has room for everyone, the abled and the disabled, the fortunate and the forsaken, the dreamers and the downtrodden alike. A world of true compassion and inclusion, where no one is left to suffer in the shadows. It is a lofty dream, perhaps, but it is one worth striving for, one that each of us can play a small part in bringing to fruition. And if we can do that, if we can open our hearts and extend our hands to those on the margins, then perhaps the struggles of that long-ago beggar and so many others like him will not have been in vain. Maybe, just maybe, Their quiet endurance in the face of the unimaginable can serve as a guiding light for us all, a reminder of what the human spirit is truly capable of overcoming. And in honouring their legacy, in learning from their hard-earned wisdom, we might just inch the world a little closer to that distant dream of a kinder tomorrow. So let us carry their stories with us. Let us hold tight to their lessons of resilience and hope. For in a world that can often be harsh and unforgiving, they are a reminder of the incredible strength that lies within each and every one of us, a strength that can carry us through even the darkest of times, towards the promise of brighter days to come. Of course, such profound revelations and insights were far beyond the downtrodden beggar as he took up his usual post outside the church that chill autumn morning. For him, there were no lofty dreams or aspirations, only the unrelenting gnaw of an empty stomach and the distant hope of a few meagre coins to see him through another day. And yet, in his own quiet way, simply by enduring, by continuing to put one foot in front of the other in a world that had given him every reason to despair, he was a living testament to the very resilience and indomitable nature of the human spirit that would one day, unbeknownst to him, inspire generations to come. It was a small thing, perhaps, a drop in the vast ocean of human suffering and perseverance, but it was his thing, his quiet contribution to the great tapestry of history. And as he raised his weary eyes to the overcast sky, silently beseeching the heavens for mercy, for just one small glimmer of hope, he had no way of knowing the profound ripples his simple, steadfast endurance would one day create. For that is often the way of true heroism, not in grand gestures or magnificent deeds, but in the quiet, everyday acts of courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. It is a lesson the beggar embodied to his very core, and it is one that still echoes through the ages, a reminder of the incredible strength and fortitude that lies within us all, waiting to be tapped in our darkest hours. So let his story be a beacon of hope for us all, a guiding light in a world that can often seem so cold and unforgiving. Let it remind us that no matter how bleak or hopeless our circumstances may appear, there is always a flicker of light waiting to guide us home. We need only have the courage to endure, to keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when every fibre of our being cries out in exhaustion and despair. For it is in those moments of quiet perseverance, of stubborn, unyielding hope against all odds, that we tap into something truly extraordinary within ourselves. And it is in those moments, as the disabled beggar of the Middle Ages knew all too well, that we discover the true depths of our own strength, our own unbreakable spirit. It is a discovery that has the power to carry us through anything, to transform even the bleakest of circumstances into an opportunity for growth, for resilience, for quiet, everyday acts of heroism. So as we go forth into our own lives, let us carry his story with us. Let us draw strength and inspiration from his unwavering courage in the face of the unimaginable. For if he could find a way to keep going, to keep hoping and believing and enduring in a world so hostile to his very existence, then surely we can find a way to do the same. It won't always be easy, of course. There will be moments of doubt and despair, moments when the road ahead seems impossibly dark and treacherous. But it is in those moments that we must remember the beggar, and so many others like him. Those quiet, unsung heroes who refused to yield, who clung to hope and humanity even in the face of the most overwhelming odds. For they are a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, a shining example of what we are all capable of when we dig deep and refuse to give up. And in honouring their legacy, in drawing strength from their stories, we tap into that same wellspring of courage and determination within ourselves. So let us go forth with their memory in our hearts. Let us face whatever trials and tribulations life may throw our way, with the same quiet fortitude and unshakable belief in a better tomorrow. For it is in embracing their spirit, their hard-earned wisdom born of suffering and perseverance, that we become our own quiet heroes. And in a world that can often seem so cold and unforgiving, that simple act of everyday heroism, of refusing to yield in the face of adversity, can make all the difference. It can be the glimmer of light that guides us through the darkness, the beacon of hope that reminds us of our own incredible strength and resilience. So let us hold tight to their stories. Let us carry their lessons with us as we navigate the twists and turns of our own journeys. For in doing so, we honor their struggles, their sacrifices, their unbreakable spirits. And we remind ourselves that no matter how dark the road may seem, there is always a way forward, if only we have the courage to keep taking that next step, to keep believing in the promise of a brighter tomorrow. That is the true legacy of the disabled in the Middle Ages, not just a litany of their hardships and sorrows, but a powerful testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It is a legacy that belongs to us all, a reminder of the quiet strength and dignity that lies within each and every one of us. And as we go forth into a world that can often seem so uncertain and challenging, it is a legacy we would do well to embrace. A guiding light to steer us through the storms, a beacon of hope to remind us of what is possible when we refuse to yield, when we cling to our humanity and our belief in a better tomorrow, no matter how dark the night may seem. For in the end, that is the true measure of a life well lived, not in grand deeds or impressive accomplishments, but in the quiet, everyday acts of resilience and hope in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a measure the disabled beggars of the Middle Ages embodied to their very core, and it is one we can all aspire to in our own ways, our own lives. So let us draw strength from their stories. Let us find inspiration in their unwavering spirits. And let us go forth into the world with the same quiet determination, the same stubborn, unshakable belief in the power of the human spirit to overcome anything. For in doing so, we honor their legacy in the truest sense, not just by remembering their struggles, but by carrying their hard-earned wisdom and resilience with us into our own battles, our own moments of darkness and despair. And in that act of remembrance, of carrying their light forward, we ensure that their struggles, their quiet acts of everyday heroism, were not in vain. We make their stories our own, weaving them into the great tapestry of human resilience and hope that stretches across the ages. It is a profound responsibility, a sacred trust passed down through the generations, but it is one we are all equal to, if only we have the courage to embrace it, the courage to keep going, to keep believing, to keep holding on to our humanity in the face of all the forces that would seek to strip it away. For in the end, that is what the disabled beggars of the Middle Ages truly teach us. Not just the incredible hardships they faced, but the even more incredible strength they found to overcome them. It is a strength that lies within us all, waiting to be tapped in our darkest hours. And as we navigate the twists and turns of our own journeys, as we face our own moments of struggle and despair, we can draw on that strength, that quiet, unshakable resilience. We can remember the beggar and so many others like him who refused to yield in the face of the most overwhelming odds. For in remembering them, in carrying their stories with us, we tap into something truly extraordinary within ourselves, a wellspring of hope and determination that can carry us through anything. And in a world that can often seem so harsh and unforgiving, that simple act of remembrance, of drawing strength from those who came before, can make all the difference. It can be the light that guides us through the darkness, the beacon of hope that reminds us of what is possible when we cling to our humanity, no matter how cold the winds may blow. So let us go forth with their memory in our hearts. Let us face the trials and tribulations ahead with the same quiet dignity and resilience they embodied. For in doing so, We become a part of their story, a link in the great chain of human perseverance that stretches back through the ages. And in becoming a part of that story, in adding our own quiet acts of everyday heroism to the tapestry, we ensure that their legacy lives on, not just as a distant memory, but as a living, breathing testament to the incredible strength and resilience of the human spirit. It is a legacy that belongs to us all. The tale of a blind pilgrim named Eldred exemplifies the day-to-day struggles of navigating medieval society with a disability. Eldred was born a peasant in the rolling hills of Wessex. As a young man, he developed cataracts that gradually robbed him of sight. In a world that prized physical labour, Eldred found himself adrift, unable to tend fields or livestock like his kin. With no recourse, he was forced to take up begging, relying on the fickle mercy of passers-by. He would tap his way precariously down muddy village paths, hoping not to stumble into ditches or pig pens, calling out for alms in a quavering voice. The infrequent coins or crusts of bread he received barely sustained him. On holy days, Eldred would station himself near the church doors, hoping the sermons on charity would loosen a few purse strings. But more often than not, he was shooed away like a mangy dog, lest his unseemly presence disturb the congregation. As Eldred aged, begging grew harder still. His joints ached from endless hours hunched in the elements. He developed a chronic cough that racked his frail frame. With no family to care for him, Eldred's lot was as bleak as the English weather. There was no respite, no light at the end of the tunnel, just day after day of unrelenting hardship until he finally succumbed. Eldred's plight, while heartrending, was all too common in the Middle Ages. For every valiant knight or prosperous merchant, there were scores of Eldreds, disabled folks living on the knife's edge of destitution. Their stories, often lost to time, paint a poignant picture of the era's brutality. The stigma and isolation that medieval disabled women endured was especially acute. In a society that venerated fertility and prized women as marriageable commodities above all else, a disability could sentence a woman to a lifetime of loneliness and penury. Such was the fate of Agnes, a young woman from a humble Yorkshire hamlet. Agnes lost her left foot to a blood infection as a child, leaving her with a pronounced limp. As she came of age, it became painfully clear that no suitor would have her. Her own father called her useless and a burden. With no marriage prospects and limited means to support herself, Agnes was consigned to the margins of village life. She eked out a meagre existence spinning wool, a task she could perform seated. The paltry income barely kept her fed. Unlike a man, Agnes could not even turn to the priesthood or monastic life, as those paths were closed to women. Her sole consolation was her faith, which she clung to with the desperate ardour of a drowning sailor, grasping at flotsam. Agnes would spend long hours in the village church, whispering fervent prayers for God to either heal her or call her home. The only time she felt peace was in those quiet moments, bathed in the coloured light of the stained glass windows, far from the callous stares and hurtful whispers of her neighbours. While Agnes's story may seem exceedingly grim by modern standards, it was a reflection of the stark realities disabled women navigated in the Middle Ages. Their hardships were amplified by the rigid gender norms and expectations of the time, with little avenue for self-sufficiency or fulfillment outside the traditional roles of wife and mother. Yet even in the face of such unrelenting adversity, some disabled medieval women managed to carve out extraordinary lives that defied the era's suffocating constraints. These rare tales of triumph offer glimmers of hope amidst the bleakness. One such beacon was Teresa de Cartagena, a deaf nun who rose to become a celebrated spiritual writer in 15th century Spain. Born into a prominent converso family, former Jews who converted to Christianity, Teresa lost her hearing at an early age, likely due to illness. In a time when deafness was seen as a manifestation of spiritual deficiency, Teresa's condition could easily have doomed her to a cloistered life of menial tasks and obscurity. But Teresa's incisive mind and unshakable faith would not be quieted. Within the walls of the Santa Clara convent in Burgos, she devoted herself to scholarly pursuits, devouring religious texts and honing her theological acumen. Teresa's erudition soon caught the attention of the convent's abbess, who encouraged her to put quill to parchment. In an era when few women dared to write, let alone disabled women, Teresa took up the challenge with gusto. Her works, including the treatises Grove of the Infirm and Wonder at the Works of God, grappled with weighty spiritual matters from the unique perspective of a deaf woman in a hearing world. With a wit and wisdom that belied her cloistered existence, Teresa boldly challenged prevailing notions of disability as divine punishment. She asserted that her deafness was not a curse, but a gift that allowed her to better commune with God, free from worldly distractions. For Teresa, disability was not an impediment to faith, but a path to enlightenment, a radical notion for the time. Teresa's works struck a chord with religious scholars and lay readers alike. Her manuscripts were widely copied and disseminated, a rarity for a female author in an age when most women remained anonymous. Luminaries like Teresa of Avila would later praise her as a spiritual foremother. While Teresa's story is undoubtedly exceptional, it underscores the latent potential that lay within so many disabled medieval women, a potential often snuffed out by the suffocating mores of the time. One can only imagine how many more Teresas might have flourished if given the chance. But Teresa was not the only disabled medieval woman to leave an indelible mark. Across the continent, in the bustling commercial hub of Lübeck, a young blind woman named Mechthild carved her own unlikely path to renown. Born into a family of successful merchants, Mechthild lost her sight to smallpox as an infant. In an era when blindness often meant a life of begging, Mechthild's family refused to consign her to such a fate. They nurtured her keen intellect, hiring tutors to read her classical texts and teach her music. As she came of age, Mechthild's beautiful singing voice began to draw attention. She would perform at family gatherings and local festivals, her haunting melodies transporting listeners to realms beyond the earthly. Word of her talent soon spread beyond Lübeck's walls. In a remarkable turn of events, Mechthild was invited to perform at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV in Prague. For a blind woman to be summoned to perform before royalty was nigh unheard of, a testament to both her prodigious gift and her family's connections. Mechthild's performances at court were met with rapturous acclaim. Nobles and dignitaries would jockey for a chance to hear her sing, transfixed by the angelic voice that seemed to emanate from another world. The emperor himself was said to have been moved to tears by her renditions of sacred hymns. Mechthild's time in Prague marked the zenith of her improbable rise. She would go on to perform across the courts of Europe, from Vienna to Avignon, her fame spreading like wildfire. In an age when most disabled people were shunned and marginalized, Mechthild had achieved a level of celebrity and acclaim that would have been unthinkable for a blind woman of humble birth. Yet for all her triumphs, Mechthild's life was not without its trials. The grueling travel and constant performance took a toll on her health. She often longed for the quiet simplicity of her family's Lübeck home. And though feted by the nobility, she was keenly aware that her disability still marked her as an oddity in their eyes, a fascinating curiosity rather than a fully equal human. Mechthild's remarkable story, like Teresa's, hints at the untapped wells of resilience and potential that lay within medieval disabled women, waiting to be unleashed. While the era's rigid social structures and superstitions kept most of these women in the shadows, the few who managed to break free and make their mark shine like beacons across the centuries. Their triumphs, however fleeting or qualified, remind us that the human spirit has always found a way to transcend the limitations imposed by society or circumstance. In an age when disability was seen as a mark of divine disfavor or demonic influence, women like Teresa and Mechthild dared to redefine it as a source of strength, creativity, and spiritual insight. Their stories also cast into sharp relief the daily indignities and challenges that their less fortunate sisters endured. For every Teresa or Mechthild who achieved a measure of renown, there were countless Agnes languishing in obscurity, their talents and dreams withered on the vine. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold space in our hearts for these forgotten women, the blind beggars, the lame spinsters, the useless daughters, whose quiet struggles and submerged longings history has all too often drowned out. In the still of the night, may their whispers find voice in our dreams. Though the medieval world was in many ways a harsher, bleaker place for the disabled than our own, the human capacity for resilience, for finding light in the darkness, remains a constant across the ages. The disabled women of the Middle Ages, in their trials and their triumphs, their anguish and their ecstasies, remind us of this enduring truth. As we pull the covers tight and let sleep's embrace carry us away, may their stories be a balm and a beacon, a reminder that even in the most trying of times, the human spirit endures, battered but unbroken, ever reaching for the light. The legacy of these remarkable disabled women also invites us to reflect on the progress we've made as a society in embracing disability, while acknowledging the distance we have yet to travel. From the medieval worldview that saw disability as a mark of sin or sorcery, we've slowly inched towards a more enlightened understanding rooted in science, empathy, and human rights. We now have laws and accommodations to protect and empower the disabled, a far cry from the cruel indifference of the Middle Ages. We celebrate disabled artists, athletes, and leaders as role models and trailblazers, rather than shunning them as pariahs. But for all our strides, the echoes of medieval stigma still reverberate in the barriers and biases disabled people face today. From inaccessible spaces to discriminatory attitudes, the shadows of the past have not fully receded. There is much work still to be done to build a world that truly values and includes all people, regardless of ability. As we reflect on the lives of disabled medieval women like Teresa, Mechthild, and the countless anonymous Agnes, we are reminded that this work is not just a moral imperative, but a kind of excavation, a reclaiming of buried human potential. Each barrier we break, each prejudice we uproot, is a small victory in a centuries-long struggle for dignity and inclusion. And so, as we slip into slumber, let us carry their stories into our dreams, not just as distant, tragic figures, but as kindred spirits in the ageless human dance of resilience and hope. Let their whispers mingle with our own aspirations for a world where no person's light is snuffed out by the cruel caprice of circumstance. In the twilight between waking and dreaming, their lives become parables, their struggles and triumphs woven into the very fabric of our shared human story. We are all, in some sense, disabled by the world's brokenness, all yearning for wholeness and acceptance. Their tales, echoing across the centuries, remind us that this yearning is the seed of all progress, all healing. As sleep's veil descends, let us hold this truth close, like a talisman against despair. The road to a just and inclusive world is long and winding, paved with the toil and tears of generations. But in the lives of these extraordinary medieval women, we find waymarkers and wellsprings, reminding us that even in the bleakest of times, the human spirit not only endures, but finds a way to soar. So let us dream of a world where no Teresas go unheard, no Mechthilds unseen, no Agnes abandoned. Let their stories be not just a lament for the past, but a summons to a more luminous future, a world where every person's gifts are nurtured, every voice cherished. As we surrender to sleep's sweet embrace, let us carry this vision into the depths of our dreaming, letting it take root and blossom. For in the end, is this not the purpose of history? To light the way forward by illuminating the paths already trodden. The disabled women of the Middle Ages, long consigned to the shadows, have much to teach us still, about resilience in the face of adversity, about finding purpose amidst pain, about the invincibility of the human spirit. As we chart our course through an uncertain world, let their stories be our compass, pointing us ever towards the light. And so, wrapped in the mantle of their hard-won wisdom, we drift off into dreamland, our hearts heavy with the weight of their struggles, but also buoyed by the limitless possibilities their lives represent. In sleep's gentle shadows, past and present blur, their whispers becoming our own, their dreams the seeds of a more just and compassionate tomorrow. As the veil of slumber descends, we carry their essence with us, a flickering flame against the darkness. We dream of a world where no child is deemed useless, where no talent goes unexplored, where each person's unique light is free to illuminate the world. This is the world Teresa, Mechtilde, and Agnes glimpsed in their mind's eye, the world they strained towards with every fibre of their being. It is the world we are called to build, brick by brick, story by story, dream by dream. So let us sleep, perchance to dream. And in dreaming, let us weave a tapestry of hope and remembrance, a tribute to the disabled women of the Middle Ages and all those who have struggled and soared in the face of impossible odds. In the quiet of the night, their stories become our lullaby, their resilience our bedrock, their faith in a better world our guiding star. As we slip into sleep's welcoming arms, we hold fast to this vision, letting it permeate our subconscious and shape our waking lives. For in the end, this is how change happens, not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in the small daily acts of empathy and understanding, the quiet weaving of a more inclusive tapestry. The disabled women of the Middle Ages, long relegated to history's footnotes, have gifted us this truth. As we honour their legacy, let us also commit to creating a world where their stories are not exceptions, but the norm. A world where every person, regardless of ability, is seen, heard, and valued. This is the dream we carry into sleep's embrace, the vision we nurture in the gentle darkness. It is a dream born of struggle and sacrifice, watered with the tears of generations, but also shot through with the unquenchable human spirit that refuses to be silenced or subdued. As we let sleep claim us, we hold this dream close, a precious seed to be tended and nurtured. For in the light of morning, it will be our task to bring this vision to fruition, to build a world that would make Teresa, Mechtilde, and Agnes proud. Their stories, whispered across the ages, have become our inheritance, our call to action. Let us answer that call with the same resilience, faith, and indomitable spirit they embodied. Let us dream their dreams forward until they become the waking reality of a more just and compassionate world. And so, cradled in sleep's gentle arms, we let their legacy be our lullaby, their courage our compass, their hope our guiding light. We rest knowing that in the morning, their work will become our own, the sacred work of weaving a world where every person can flourish and shine. As the last tendrils of consciousness slip away, we surrender to sleep's sweet embrace, secure in the knowledge that we do not dream alone. The disabled women of the Middle Ages, and all those who have struggled for justice and dignity across the ages, dream with us, their hopes and visions intertwined with our own. In this silent communion, we draw strength and inspiration, knowing that we are part of an ageless human tapestry, woven of dreams and deeds, tears and triumphs. We sleep, not to escape the world, but to dream it anew, a world where the legacy of these remarkable women can finally blossom into fullness. So let us dream, deeply and fearlessly, letting their stories be the warp and weft of our own. For in the crucible of dreams, the world is remade, and the impossible becomes the inevitable. As we slip into the welcoming darkness, we carry their flame, their faith, their unquenchable hope. We sleep, perchance, to dream, and in dreaming we light the way forward towards a dawn where every person, in all their glorious diversity, can rise and shine. As the Black Death's shadow receded, it left behind a changed world, one where old certainties had crumbled and new ideas cautiously took root. The immense loss of life had disrupted the social order and labour force, compelling many to question long-held notions about the nature of disability and society's obligation to the infirm. In the aftermath of the plague, the sheer scarcity of able-bodied workers meant that sometimes even those with disabilities were called upon to fill vital roles. Records from the period show a small but significant rise in disabled individuals employed as craftsmen, scribes, and even teachers. This shift, born of necessity, subtly challenged prevailing assumptions that the disabled were incapable of meaningful work. At the same time, the late Middle Ages saw a gradual evolution in how disability was perceived and treated. While medieval medicine was still rudimentary by modern standards, there was a slow move away from purely spiritual explanations for disability and towards a more scientific understanding. Physicians and scholars began to study the human body with greater depth, laying the groundwork for more advanced treatments. One pioneering figure in this nascent medical approach was French surgeon Guy de Chauliac. Serving as the personal physician to Pope Clement VI, Chauliac had a front-row seat to the devastation of the Black Death. His experiences led him to write the influential text Chirurgia Magna, which included detailed descriptions of various disabilities and their treatments. While still limited by the knowledge of his time, Chauliac's work represented an important step towards a more empirical view of disability. This subtle shift in perspective was also reflected in the rise of rudimentary prosthetics and assistive devices. Although crude by today's standards, these early innovations hinted at a growing recognition that disability could be accommodated and adapted to. Simple crutches, hand trestles, and even primitive wheelchairs began to appear, offering a modicum of greater mobility and independence. Institutions to care for the disabled and infirm also gradually emerged in the late medieval period. Monasteries had long served as de facto refuges for the disabled, but now more dedicated hospitals and almshouses began to dot the landscape. While conditions in these early facilities were often grim, their very existence signaled a growing sense of societal responsibility for the disabled. One notable example was the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century but greatly expanded in the late Middle Ages. By the 15th century, it had grown into a sprawling complex with multiple wards, including dedicated areas for the blind, the lame, and those with mental illnesses. Though woefully overcrowded and unsanitary by modern standards, the Hôtel Dieu nevertheless represented a landmark institution in the history of disability care. Of course, this evolution in thinking was gradual, uneven, and far from complete. For the vast majority of disabled individuals, life remained a relentless struggle with precious few supports. Superstition, stigma, and outright abuse were still rampant and would persist for centuries to come. But in the waning years of the Middle Ages, one can discern the first stirrings of a more enlightened approach. As we look back from our vantage point today, it's tempting to view this era as one of unrelenting darkness for the disabled. And indeed, the challenges they faced were immense and often insurmountable. But amidst the struggles and the suffering were also glimmers of resilience, ingenuity, and the unquenchable human spirit. From the blind poet John Audible dictating his moving verses, to the unnamed amputees learning to navigate the world on crutches, disabled individuals in the Middle Ages fought to carve out lives of meaning and dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. Their stories may be largely lost to history, but their legacy endures in the ongoing struggle for inclusion and equality. As you drift off to sleep, let your dreams be populated by these forgotten heroes, the disabled artisans, scholars, and everyday folk who quietly defied their era's limitations. Imagine their hardships, but also their triumphs, however small and unsung. And in honouring their memory, let us renew our own commitment to building a world where no person is cast aside or left behind because of disability. In the words of the 14th century poet Geoffrey Chaucer, "As long as poverty is general, it is better to bear it in good spirits than to depart from this world." The disabled of the Middle Ages bore their lot with remarkable fortitude and grace. May their enduring spirit light our way forward, until the day when inclusion is no longer a dream, but a lived reality for all. Good night. As the Black Death ravaged Europe in the 14th century, it left an indelible mark on society, shaking the very foundations of medieval life. Amidst the immense suffering and loss, this catastrophic event also sparked a subtle shift in how people perceived illness, infirmity, and disability. The sheer scale of the pandemic meant that no one was spared its wrath, rich or poor, able-bodied or disabled. In a way, it was a grim equalizer. Suddenly, the notion that disability was solely a divine punishment or moral failing began to ring hollow. If even the pious and privileged could fall victim to such a cruel fate, then perhaps there was more to these afflictions than met the eye. Slowly but surely, a more scientific and medical understanding of disability started to take root. Scholars and physicians, though still limited by the knowledge of their time, began to seek out natural explanations for these conditions. They studied the human body with a newfound curiosity, trying to unravel the mysteries of its workings. This shift in perspective manifested itself in small but significant ways. Across Europe, hospitals and care facilities specifically designed for the disabled and infirm began to emerge. These institutions, often founded by religious orders or wealthy benefactors, provided a modicum of support and comfort to those who had previously been left to fend for themselves on the streets. One such place was the Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London, established in the 12th century. Initially founded to care for the poor and sick, it gradually evolved to also accommodate those with disabilities. Records show that by the late 14th century, the hospital was providing long-term care for blind, deaf, and paralysed individuals. While these early hospitals were a far cry from the comprehensive care we know today, they represented a crucial first step towards recognising the needs of the disabled. No longer were they seen as mere burdens to society, but as human beings deserving of compassion and support. This changing attitude was further reflected in the emergence of primitive prosthetics and assistive devices. Though rudimentary by modern standards, these innovations hinted at a growing desire to improve the lives of those with disabilities. One remarkable example is the iron hand of Gottfried Goetz von Berlichingen, a German knight who lost his right hand in a siege in 1504. Unwilling to let his injury define him, Goetz commissioned a series of sophisticated prosthetic hands that allowed him to continue fighting and leading his troops. His story became a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit, even in the face of disability. Of course, these advancements were still few and far between, and the majority of disabled people in the Middle Ages continued to face unimaginable hardships. But the seeds of change had been planted, and they would continue to grow in the centuries that followed. As we reflect on this pivotal period in history, it's important to remember the bravery and determination of those who paved the way for the rights and accommodations we have today. Their stories may be lost to time, but their legacy lives on in every accessible building, every supportive policy, and every inclusive community. In the words of the great Helen Keller, who herself triumphed over disability, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it." May we continue to strive for a world where every person, regardless of their abilities, has the chance to thrive and leave their mark. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us hold in our hearts the resilience of the human spirit and the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. Good night and sweet dreams. As we delve deeper into the realities of being disabled in the Middle Ages, it's important to recognize the glimmers of light amidst the darkness. Throughout this tumultuous period, there were remarkable individuals who defied the odds and left an indelible mark on history, despite the immense challenges they faced due to their disabilities. One such extraordinary figure was Teresa de Cartagena, a deaf nun who became a celebrated spiritual writer in 15th century Spain. Born into a prominent converso family, Teresa lost her hearing at a young age, which profoundly shaped her life and worldview. In a time when deafness was often seen as a curse or punishment, Teresa chose to view her disability as a divine gift, a path to a deeper, more contemplative relationship with God. Despite the communication barriers and stigmas she faced, Teresa refused to be silenced. She poured her insights and experiences into her writing, crafting eloquent treatises on spirituality, prayer, and the inner life. Her most famous work, Grove of the Infirm, was a groundbreaking meditation on the meaning and purpose of suffering, drawing on her own struggles with deafness and chronic illness. Through her powerful words, Teresa challenged prevailing assumptions about disability and gender in medieval society. She asserted that physical limitations could be a source of spiritual strength and enlightenment, rather than a mark of divine disfavor. Her ideas resonated deeply with readers both within and beyond the convent walls, earning her a reputation as a visionary thinker and a beacon of hope for the marginalized. Teresa's legacy endures to this day as a testament to the indomitable human spirit. Her story reminds us that even in the bleakest of circumstances, individuals can rise above their challenges and make a profound impact on the world around them. In a time when disabled voices were so often silenced and ignored, Teresa de Cartagena dared to speak her truth, and in doing so, she paved the way for greater understanding and acceptance of difference. As we consider other remarkable disabled figures of the Middle Ages, the blind poet John Audible comes to mind. Born in the early 15th century in Shropshire, England, Audible served as a chaplain and canon before losing his sight later in life. Rather than retreating into despair, he channeled his experiences into his poetry, grappling with themes of faith, mortality, and the human condition. In his most famous work, Poems and Carols, Audible reflects on his blindness with a mix of sorrow and acceptance. He mourns the loss of simple pleasures, like gazing upon the beauty of nature or reading his beloved books. Yet he also finds solace in his inner vision, his heightened appreciation for music and song, and his unshakable trust in God's plan. Through his verses, Audible invites the reader into his world, painting vivid pictures of medieval life with all its joys and hardships. He writes of the changing seasons, the toil of farmers and labourers, the festivities of holy days and holidays. He captures the earthy humour and resilient spirit of the common folk, while also pondering the great mysteries of existence. For Audible, poetry was a means of transcending his physical limitations and connecting with others on a deeper level. His words had the power to move and inspire, to offer comfort and encouragement in times of darkness. He showed that blindness need not be a barrier to creativity, wisdom, or spiritual insight, that the human mind and heart could soar free even when the body was constrained. Like Teresa de Cartagena, John Audelet's life and work stand as a powerful reminder of the resilience and potential of disabled people in the face of adversity. Through their art and their example, they challenged the narrow confines of medieval society and asserted their fundamental humanity and worth. They proved that disability was not a defining trait, but rather one aspect of a complex and multifaceted identity. Of course, Teresa and John were exceptional individuals who had the good fortune of education and social status. For the vast majority of disabled people in the Middle Ages, life was a constant struggle for survival, with few opportunities for self-expression or personal fulfillment. Many were forced to rely on begging or the charity of others to get by, their talents and potential often going unrecognized and untapped. Yet even among the nameless masses, there were those who managed to carve out a niche for themselves, to make a living and a life despite the odds. Records from the period show disabled artisans and craftsmen who adapted their techniques and tools to suit their needs, finding ways to practice their trades with skill and ingenuity. In France, for example, there are accounts of blind woodworkers who used their heightened sense of touch to create intricate carvings and furniture pieces. In England, disabled weavers and tailors formed their own guilds, pooling their resources and supporting one another in their work. These enterprising individuals demonstrated that disability was not an insurmountable barrier to productivity and self-sufficiency, that with determination and adaptability, even the most marginalized could find a way to thrive. Of course, such success stories were the exception rather than the rule. For every disabled artisan who managed to make a living, there were countless others who were left to fend for themselves on the streets, their basic needs going unmet. The lack of a social safety net or reliable support system meant that disability all too often went hand in hand with poverty, isolation, and despair. Recognizing this grim reality, some medieval institutions and individuals did make efforts to provide aid and assistance to the disabled and infirm. Monasteries and religious orders often took in the sick and the lame, offering food, shelter, and basic medical care. Wealthy patrons sometimes established almshouses or hospitals specifically for the disabled, though these were few and far between. One of the most famous examples of medieval disability care was the Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London, founded in the 12th century by the monk Rahere. The hospital provided free treatment to the poor and the sick, with a special ward set aside for those with leprosy and other disabling conditions. Though the care was rudimentary by modern standards, it represented a rare glimmer of compassion in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving world. Similarly, in the 14th century, the French King Louis IX established the 15 Hospice in Paris, specifically for the blind and visually impaired. The hospice provided housing, food, and a small stipend for up to 300 residents, who were expected to pray for the king and his family in exchange for their care. While the conditions were far from ideal, the 15 represented a significant step forward in recognizing the needs and rights of disabled people. Yet for all these scattered efforts at charity and support, the overwhelming majority of disabled people in the Middle Ages were left to navigate a world that was not built with their needs in mind. The very structure of medieval society, with its rigid hierarchies and narrow gender roles, made life all the more challenging for those who did not fit the mold. For disabled women in particular, the path was often impossibly steep. In a time when a woman's worth was so often tied to her domestic skills and reproductive capacity, a disability could be seen as a mark of failure or inadequacy. Disabled women were often shunned as potential marriage partners, denied the opportunity to bear children or run a household. They were even more vulnerable to poverty, abuse, and exploitation than their male counterparts. The story of Maud de Ufford, a 14th century English noblewoman, illustrates the precarious position of disabled women in medieval society. Maud was the daughter of an earl and the widow of a wealthy knight. But she suffered from a debilitating spinal condition that left her bedridden and in constant pain. Despite her high social status, Maud was essentially a prisoner in her own home, unable to fulfill the duties expected of a woman of her rank. In her will, Maud bequeathed a portion of her estate to her devoted servant Alice, who had cared for her tirelessly throughout her illness. Yet Maud's male relatives challenged the will, arguing that a disabled woman could not possibly be of sound mind to make such a decision. The case dragged on for years, with Alice's inheritance hanging in the balance, a stark reminder of the legal and social barriers faced by disabled women in asserting their basic rights and autonomy. For Maud and countless others like her, disability was a source of constant struggle and frustration, compounded by the rigid gender norms and expectations of the time. Yet even in the face of such adversity, many disabled women found ways to assert their agency and make their mark on the world, whether through their art, their faith, or their quiet acts of resilience and defiance. As we continue to explore the complex realities of disability in the Middle Ages, it's important to keep these stories of struggle and triumph in mind. They remind us of the incredible diversity of human experience and the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the most daunting of challenges. In a time when disabled voices were so often silenced and marginalized, these glimmers of light shine all the brighter, illuminating the way forward to a more just and inclusive world. Of course, the path to that world was a long and winding one, with many stumbles and setbacks along the way. The medieval period was, in many ways, a time of darkness and ignorance when it came to understanding and treating disability. Superstition and folklore held sway, with many seeing disability as a sign of divine punishment or demonic possession. Even the brightest minds of the age were not immune to these misconceptions. The renowned philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, for example, argued that disability was a result of original sin, a mark of imperfection in a fallen world. He believed that the disabled were destined for suffering in this life, but could hope for redemption and wholeness in the next. Such attitudes had very real and devastating consequences for disabled people in medieval society. Those with visible or obvious disabilities were often shunned and ostracized, forced to the margins of their communities. They were seen as objects of pity or scorn, their humanity diminished in the eyes of others. This was especially true for those with conditions like leprosy, which was so feared and misunderstood in the medieval world. Lepers were often forced to wear distinctive clothing or carry bells to warn others of their approach. They were banished to the outskirts of towns and villages, cut off from the social and spiritual life of their communities. One poignant example of this isolation can be found in the story of a young French woman known only as Rachel. Born into a wealthy family in the 13th century, Rachel contracted leprosy as a teenager and was forced to leave her home and enter a leper colony. There, she was stripped of her name and identity, known simply as the Maiden with the Disease. Despite the unimaginable hardships she faced, Rachel found solace in her faith and in the company of her fellow sufferers. She became known for her kindness and compassion, tending to the sick and the dying with a gentle touch and a soothing word. In the midst of so much suffering and despair, Rachel's example stood as a beacon of hope and humanity. Yet for all her quiet courage, Rachel's story underscores the brutal realities faced by so many disabled people in the Middle Ages. Cut off from the mainstream of society, denied the most basic human rights and dignities, they were left to fend for themselves in a world that had little use or understanding for them. This was especially true for those with mental or cognitive disabilities, who were often seen as possessed by demons or cursed by God. In a time when the concept of mental illness was poorly understood, those with conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder were often subjected to horrific treatments like exorcism, bloodletting, and even lobotomy. One of the most famous cases of medieval madness was that of King Henry VI of England, who experienced bouts of catatonia and delusion throughout his reign in the 15th century. Henry's condition was widely attributed to demonic possession or witchcraft, and he was subjected to all manner of quackery and superstition in an attempt to cure him. In reality, Henry likely suffered from a genetic disorder that caused his mental instability, yet in the absence of modern medical knowledge, his condition was seen as a sign of divine disfavor or moral failure. His story illustrates the immense challenge of living with a mental disability in a time when such conditions were so poorly understood and so heavily stigmatized. Of course, not all disabled people in the Middle Ages were consigned to a life of isolation and despair. Some, like Teresa de Cartagena and John Audeley, found ways to transcend their limitations and make a mark on the world through their art and their faith. Others, like the disabled artisans and craftsmen who formed their own guilds, carved out a niche for themselves in the economic life of their communities. Yet, even for these relative success stories, life was far from easy. Disabled people in the Middle Ages faced constant barriers and challenges, from the physical inaccessibility of their environment to the social stigma and discrimination that dogged their every step. They had to fight for every scrap of dignity and autonomy, every opportunity to live and work and love on their own terms. In this sense, their struggles were not so different from those faced by disabled people today. While we have certainly come a long way in terms of medical knowledge, assistive technology, and legal protections, the fight for full inclusion and equality is far from over. Disabled people around the world continue to face barriers and prejudices that limit their potential and deny their basic humanity. Yet as we look back on the lives and legacies of disabled people in the Middle Ages, we can find inspiration in their resilience, their creativity, and their determination to thrive in the face of incredible odds. They remind us that disability is not a monolith, but rather a rich and varied tapestry of human experience, woven through with threads of pain and joy, struggle and triumph. In the end, their stories are not so much about the specific challenges of being disabled in a particular time and place, but about the enduring power of the human spirit to adapt, to endure, and to find meaning and purpose in even the darkest of circumstances. They speak to the fundamental dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of their abilities or limitations. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold these stories close to our hearts and let them guide us towards a world of greater empathy, understanding, and inclusion. Let us honor the legacy of those who came before us, and let us work to build a future in which every person, disabled or not, can live a life of purpose and possibility. For in the end, we are all part of the same human family, bound together by our common hopes and dreams, our common struggles and triumphs. And it is only by recognizing and celebrating our shared humanity that we can hope to build a better world for all. As the sun set over the thatched roofs and cobblestone streets of medieval Europe, the flickering glow of candlelight illuminated the faces of the town's inhabitants. Among them were the disabled and infirm, whose struggles and hardships were etched into the very fabric of their daily lives. In a society where physical strength and ability were prized above all else, those with disabilities were often relegated to the margins, viewed with a mixture of pity, fear, and suspicion. The prevailing belief was that disability was a punishment from God, a sign of moral failing, or divine retribution for past sins. But what was life really like for the disabled in the Middle Ages? To understand their plight, we must first delve into the complex tapestry of medieval society, where superstition and religious doctrine intertwined with the harsh realities of life. Imagine for a moment navigating the narrow, winding streets of a medieval town with a physical impairment. The uneven cobblestones and the absence of any kind of accommodations made even the simplest tasks a daunting challenge. For the visually impaired, the lack of braille or any form of organised assistance meant a life of perpetual darkness and dependence on others. The story of Aldrich, a blind beggar in 14th century France, offers a poignant glimpse into this reality. Born to peasant parents, Aldrich lost his sight to a childhood illness and was left to fend for himself in a world that had little compassion for the disabled. Each day, he would make his way to the steps of the local church, his plaintive cries for alms echoing through the streets. The coins that passers-by dropped into his outstretched hand were often his only means of survival. But Aldrich's tale was not unique. Across medieval Europe, disability was a one-way ticket to a life of poverty and social isolation. Without the means to work or support themselves, many of the disabled were forced to rely on the kindness of strangers or the meagre provisions of the church. For women, the burden of disability was compounded by the oppressive gender norms of the time. In a society where a woman's worth was tied to her ability to bear children and manage a household, a physical impairment could spell a life of destitution and neglect. The story of Margaretha, a young woman with a clubfoot in 15th century Germany, illustrates this harsh reality. Shunned by her family and unable to find a husband, Margaretha was left to wander the streets, her disability a visible mark of her perceived worthlessness. Yet even amidst the darkness, there were glimmers of light. Rare individuals who defied the odds and left an indelible mark on history. One such figure was Teresa de Cartagena, a 15th century Spanish nun who lost her hearing in her youth. Despite the immense challenges she faced, Teresa refused to be silenced. She went on to become a celebrated spiritual writer, her words offering solace and inspiration to countless readers. In her most famous work, Grove of the Infirm, Teresa grapples with the spiritual dimensions of her deafness, seeing it not as a punishment, but as a path to a deeper understanding of God's grace. "It is not deafness itself that can harm or disturb me," she wrote, "but rather the lack of care given to those who suffer from it." Teresa's insights were a rare beacon of empathy in a society that often viewed disability with a mixture of revulsion and indifference. But her story also underscores the immense disparities that existed within medieval society. As a member of a wealthy and influential family, Teresa had access to education and resources that were simply out of reach for the vast majority of disabled people. For the poor and the powerless, disability was often a death sentence. Without the support of family or community, many were left to fend for themselves on the streets, their lives cut short by disease, starvation, and neglect. The lucky few might find shelter in one of the handful of hospitals and almshouses that began to emerge in the later Middle Ages, but these were often little more than warehouses for the sick and dying, offering little in the way of genuine care or support. One such institution was St. Leonard's Hospital in York, England, founded in the 12th century to care for the sick and the poor. Records from the hospital offer a grim glimpse into the lives of its disabled residents, many of whom were simply left to languish in squalid conditions until death claimed them. But even within the walls of St. Leonard's, there were moments of grace and humanity. The hospital's records also speak of the kindness of the nuns who tended to the sick and the dying, offering what comfort they could in the face of overwhelming suffering. And then there were the battlefield injuries, the shattered limbs, the disfiguring scars, the wounds that never healed. In a time when warfare was a constant presence, disability was an all too common consequence of the clash of swords and the hail of arrows. The Crusades, in particular, left a grim legacy of broken bodies and shattered lives. Thousands of soldiers returned home from the Holy Land bearing the scars of battle, their once strong bodies ravaged by disease, hunger, and the brutal realities of medieval combat. One such soldier was Geoffroy de la Tour, a French knight who lost his right arm in the Third Crusade. For Geoffroy, the injury was a bitter blow, a reminder of the sacrifices he had made in the name of God and King. but it was also a mark of honor, a testament to his bravery and his willingness to lay down his life for a higher cause. In the end, Geoffroy was one of the lucky ones. He returned home to his family's estate, where he lived out his days in relative comfort, his missing arm a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. But for countless other disabled veterans, the road ahead was far more uncertain. Without the support of a wealthy family or a generous patron, many were left to fend for themselves, their injuries a constant reminder of the sacrifices they had made and the indifference of the society they had fought to protect. Some turned to begging, their battle scars a mute appeal for the charity of passers-by. Others simply faded into obscurity, their stories lost to the mists of time. But even as the Middle Ages drew to a close, there were signs of change on the horizon. The Black Death, which tore through Europe in the 14th century, had a profound impact on medieval society, challenging long-held assumptions about the nature of disability and disease. In the wake of the plague, a new understanding of the human body began to emerge, one that saw illness and disability not as a divine punishment, but as a natural consequence of the frailties of the flesh. This shift in perspective would pave the way for the development of new medical treatments and a more scientific approach to the study of the human body. At the same time, the rise of humanism in the late Middle Ages brought a new focus on the individual and a growing recognition of the inherent dignity of all human beings, regardless of their physical abilities. This newfound empathy would slowly begin to chip away at the walls of prejudice and superstition that had long surrounded disability. One of the most striking examples of this shift can be seen in the life of the 16th century French philosopher Michel de Montaigne. Born with a severe limp that left him in constant pain, Montaigne refused to let his disability define him. Instead, he used his experiences as a lens through which to view the world, crafting essays that explored the nature of human suffering and the resilience of the human spirit. "I have seen no more evident monstrosity and miracle in the world than myself," Montaigne wrote in one of his most famous essays. "We are, I know not how, double in ourselves, so that what we believe we disbelieve, and cannot rid ourselves of what we condemn." Montaigne's words offer a powerful reminder of the enduring resilience of the human spirit, a resilience that has carried disabled people through the darkest chapters of history and into the light of a more inclusive future. For as long as there have been humans, there have been those among us who have had to navigate the world with different abilities and challenges. And while the road to true equality is still a long and winding one, the stories of those who came before us serve as a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. From the blind beggars of medieval France to the deaf poets of Renaissance Spain, from the battle-scarred veterans of the Crusades to the brilliant minds of the Enlightenment, the history of disability is a history of struggle, of perseverance, and ultimately of triumph over adversity. As we reflect on this history, let us remember the words of Helen Keller, one of the most iconic figures in the history of disability rights. "Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it." In the end, perhaps this is the most enduring lesson of all, that no matter how dark the night may seem, there is always the promise of a new dawn. And as long as there are those among us who refuse to be defined by their limitations, that dawn will always come. So let us hold fast to that promise, even as the candles flicker and the shadows lengthen. Let us remember the stories of those who came before us, and let us carry their legacy forward into a brighter, more inclusive future. For in the end, it is only by embracing the full spectrum of human experience that we can truly build a world that is worthy of the name civilization. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander through the winding streets of medieval Europe, and let the stories of the disabled and the disenfranchised be a reminder of the enduring power of the human spirit. For in the end, it is only by learning from the past that we can hope to build a better future. A future in which all people, regardless of their abilities or challenges, can live with dignity, with purpose, and with hope. As the Black Death ravaged Europe in the 14th century, it left a trail of devastation and loss in its wake. Amidst the immeasurable suffering, however, something unexpected began to emerge. A slow but significant shift in how medieval society perceived and treated those with disabilities. In the face of such overwhelming mortality, the traditional notion that disability was a divine punishment or moral failing started to lose its grip. After all, if the plague could strike down even the most devout and able-bodied, then perhaps infirmity was not a mark of spiritual deficiency, but simply a fact of human existence. This realization, born of unimaginable tragedy, planted the seeds for a more compassionate and inclusive approach to disability. One of the most tangible manifestations of this change was the gradual rise of hospitals and care facilities dedicated to serving the disabled and infirm. Prior to the late Middle Ages, such institutions were exceedingly rare, leaving most people with disabilities to fend for themselves or rely on the charity of their communities. But as the plague reshaped society, it also spurred the creation of more formalized support systems. Take, for example, the Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London. Founded in 1123, it was one of the few early medieval hospitals that catered to the disabled. But in the aftermath of the Black Death, it significantly expanded its mission and capacity, becoming a vital refuge for those with disabilities who had nowhere else to turn. Similar institutions began to appear across Europe, offering food, shelter, and basic medical care to the most vulnerable members of society. Of course, these early hospitals were a far cry from the advanced medical facilities we know today. Treatment was rudimentary at best, and many patients still suffered immensely, but their mere existence represented a crucial step forward, an acknowledgement that people with disabilities deserved care and support, rather than scorn and neglect. This shift in perspective was further reflected in the emerging field of prosthetics and assistive devices. While crude by modern standards, the late Middle Ages saw the development of increasingly sophisticated artificial limbs, crutches, and other aids designed to help people with disabilities navigate their world. These innovations were driven in part by the need to support veterans who had been injured in the era's many wars and conflicts, but they also benefited civilians with congenital or acquired disabilities. One remarkable figure who embodied this new spirit of innovation was the German knight Götz von Berlichingen. Born in 1480, Götz lost his right hand in a cannon explosion during a siege. But rather than accepting his disability as a fate, he commissioned a series of intricate iron prostheses that allowed him to continue fighting and riding. His iron hand, as it came to be known, featured articulated fingers and a complex system of springs and levers, enabling Götz to grip a sword or lance with astonishing dexterity. While few could afford such a marvel of engineering, Götz's story nonetheless inspired others to seek out creative solutions to their own physical challenges. Yet even as these technological and institutional advancements offered new hope to people with disabilities, the road to true equality remained long and arduous. Stigma, superstition, and discrimination continued to plague the disabled, and many still found themselves marginalized and mistreated by mainstream society. Change, as is so often the case, came slowly and incrementally, one small step at a time. Perhaps no one understood this bittersweet reality better than Teresa de Cartagena, a deaf nun who lived in the 15th century Spain. Born into a wealthy family, Teresa lost her hearing at a young age due to illness. Despite the considerable privileges afforded by her social status, she still faced immense challenges and prejudice as a deaf woman in a hearing world. But Teresa refused to be defined by her disability. Instead, she turned to her faith and her intellect, becoming a celebrated spiritual writer and thinker. In her most famous work, Grove of the Infirm, Teresa reflects on the experience of being deaf in a society that little understood or accommodated her needs. With profound insight and empathy, she argues that disability is not a punishment or a failing, but a unique aspect of the human experience, one that can offer its own path to wisdom and spiritual fulfillment. Just as the blind man carries his witness in his hands, Teresa writes, so too does the deaf woman carry hers in the quiet of her soul. Her words, scribbled in the flickering candlelight of a convent cell, offered a beacon of hope and solidarity to countless other disabled people who felt isolated and alone. In giving voice to her own struggles and triumphs, Teresa helped to chip away at the walls of fear and ignorance that had so long surrounded disability. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, the seeds that Teresa and her contemporaries planted began to take root. Slowly but surely, European society started to recognize the fundamental humanity and worth of people with disabilities. Hospitals and almshouses multiplied, offering care and refuge to those who had once been left to fend for themselves. Prosthetics and assistive devices grew ever more sophisticated, giving people with disabilities greater independence and control over their lives. And a new generation of writers, artists, and thinkers emerged to challenge the old stigmas and superstitions, asserting the inherent dignity and value of every human being. Of course, this progress was neither linear nor complete. Even today, in our supposedly enlightened age, people with disabilities still face myriad barriers and inequities. But the story of disability in the Middle Ages reminds us of just how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. In the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of figures like Teresa de Cartagena and Götz von Berlichingen is not their individual achievements, but the way they paved the way for others to follow in their footsteps. By living their lives with courage, determination, and grace, they showed that disability need not be a sentence of suffering and exclusion, but a source of strength, creativity, and wisdom. They taught us that every human being, no matter their physical or mental differences, has something valuable to contribute to the world. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry that lesson with us into our dreams. Let us remember that the history of disability is not just a chronicle of hardship and oppression, but also a testament to the resilience and indomitable spirit of the human soul. And let us pledge to do our part in building a world where every person, regardless of ability or infirmity, is treated with the dignity, respect, and compassion they deserve. In the words of Teresa de Cartagena, God does not look at the outward appearance, but at the heart. May we all strive to see each other with such clarity and grace in the Middle Ages and beyond. The incredible resilience and fortitude of disabled individuals like Teresa de Cartagena and John Audible serve as powerful testaments to the human spirit in the face of immense adversity. Despite the harsh realities of their time, they managed to leave an indelible mark on history through their gifts of writing and poetry. While it's heartening to hear of the occasional disabled person who beat the odds and achieved success, for the vast majority, disability meant a life sentence of hardship and deprivation. Social class played an enormous role in determining one's fate. A disabled peasant faced a very different reality than a disabled noble or merchant. Imagine being born with a disability into a poor peasant family in a medieval village. Your parents are tenant farmers, toiling away in the fields from dawn to dusk just to eke out a meagre living. They can barely feed their able-bodied children, let alone support a child who cannot work. You are seen as just another mouth to feed, a burden on an already struggling family. As you come of age, it becomes clear that you will never be able to handle the back-breaking labour required of most peasants. The simple, repetitive tasks that allow your siblings to contribute are impossible with your condition. You try your best to help in whatever small ways you can, but you are painfully aware of your limitations. Your options are few. Perhaps your family arranges a marriage, hoping to secure your future with a partner. But disabled peasants were often seen as undesirable mates. If you're lucky, your spouse and their family accept you and do their best to support you. But it's just as likely that you're resented, mistreated, or abandoned. More often, disabled peasants had no choice but to resort to begging. In a world without social safety nets or disability benefits, begging was the only means of survival for many. Day after day, you sit on the street outside the village church, hoping the coins tossed your way will be enough to buy a crust of bread. It's a grim, desperate existence. You are completely dependent on the charity and goodwill of others. Some take pity and give generously. Others mock you, abuse you, or chase you away like a stray dog. You have no rights, no protections. You are utterly vulnerable and alone. As a disabled woman, the challenges are even greater. Medieval society was intensely patriarchal, and women were already seen as the weaker sex. A woman with a disability was doubly disadvantaged. Your marriage prospects are slim to none. You are at high risk of abuse and exploitation. Even begging is more difficult and dangerous for a woman on the streets. But even amidst the bleakness, there were rare glimmers of light and humanity. Scattered throughout medieval Europe were a handful of hospitals, almshouses, and charitable institutions dedicated to aiding the sick, disabled, and destitute. One such place was the Hospital of St. John in Bruges, Belgium. Founded in the 12th century, it was one of the earliest and largest medieval hospitals, caring for the poor, disabled, and elderly. At a time when many saw disability as a punishment from God, the brothers and sisters of St. John's offered mercy and kindness. Imagine you are a disabled beggar who has managed to make the arduous journey to Bruges seeking help. You arrive at the gates of St. John's emaciated, exhausted, your few possessions in a tattered bundle. A kind-faced nun ushers you inside, out of the cold. For the first time in memory, you have a roof over your head and food in your belly. The nuns tend to your needs, cleaning and dressing your wounds, clothing you in a warm robe. They do not pepper you with questions or treat you with scorn. There is only gentleness and understanding. In the great hall, you see others like yourself, the lame, the blind, the palsied. Here, there is no shame in your condition. You are treated with dignity as a child of God. The sisters teach you skills like weaving or candle making that you can do with your disability. For once, you feel a sense of purpose. It's not a life of ease, by any means. You are still bound by the rules and routines of institutional living. But it is a marked improvement from the streets. You have a small measure of security, of belonging. In this community of the broken and cast off, you find a sort of home. Places like St. John's were tragically rare in the Middle Ages. For every disabled person who found refuge in a charitable institution, countless others suffered in silence and anonymity. But they stand as small points of light in the darkness, testaments to the better angels of human nature. While treatment of the disabled in medieval times was often appalling by modern standards, it's important to view it in the context of the age. Life was hard for everyone, not just the disabled. Violence, disease, and deprivation were rampant. There was little understanding of disability from a medical or scientific standpoint. Viewed through that lens, even the minor accommodations and acts of charity afforded to the disabled can be seen as remarkable for their time. The nuns who bathed and fed disabled beggars, the noblemen who kept disabled jesters and dwarves as companions, the villages that allowed the disabled to glean the fields after harvest. These were small mercies in a merciless age. And it is perhaps from these small seeds of compassion that our modern ideas of accessibility and disability rights first began to grow. As medieval society was ravaged by the Black Death and other upheavals, old certainties began to crumble. The Church's monopoly on ideas started to weaken. A new spirit of inquiry and humanism began to take root. In the late Middle Ages, we begin to see the first stirrings of a different approach to disability. Hospitals and care homes, while still rare, became more common. Primitive prosthetics and assistive devices, like hand treadles for the lame, began to emerge. Disability was increasingly seen as a medical condition to be treated, rather than a mark of divine judgment. One figure who embodied this slow shift was Johann Ieperman, a Flemish surgeon in the 14th century. Ieperman authored a groundbreaking treatise on surgery and wound treatment that included detailed instructions for amputations and other procedures common in disabled patients. While his methods were still crude by today's standards, Ieperman's empirical, scientific approach foreshadowed the medical model of disability that would come to dominate in later centuries. These changes were gradual, halting, and far from universal. Disabled people in the Middle Ages still faced profound oppression, stigma, and misery. But the old attitudes were beginning to evolve, paving the way for the disability rights movements to come. It would take centuries of activism and struggle for disabled people to win legal recognition of their basic rights and humanity. From the 18th century deaf communities of Paris and London fighting for sign language, to the US Capitol crawl protests for the Americans with Disabilities Act, courageous individuals have always led the charge. We owe those pioneers a profound debt of gratitude. Their efforts made possible a world in which a person with paraplegia can be an Olympic athlete. A person with Down syndrome can be a business owner. A person with autism can be a renowned scientist. A world where disabled children are guaranteed an education. Disabled adults have marriage rights and job protections. Disabled veterans receive state-of-the-art care. A world, though still deeply imperfect, that is at least striving to be accessible to all. As we drift off tonight, let us hold space for all the disabled souls of ages past who were denied such possibilities. The blind beggars, the lame peasants, the crooked and cast off. May we honour their memory by continuing the work of building a society in which every person, regardless of ability, is valued and empowered to live a life of dignity. For in doing so, we affirm the inherent worth of all people, past, present, and future. As we've seen, the experience of being disabled in the Middle Ages was often one of isolation, stigma, and immense hardship. But even amidst the darkness, there were glimmers of light. Extraordinary individuals who defied the odds and left an enduring mark on history. One such luminary was Teresa de Cartagena, a remarkable 15th century Spanish nun who refused to let her deafness define her. Born into a wealthy converso family, Teresa lost her hearing at a young age, a condition that at the time was seen as a curse or punishment from God. But Teresa had a different perspective. In her groundbreaking spiritual treatise, Grove of the Infirm, she reframed her disability as a blessing, a divine gift that allowed her to turn inward and fully devote herself to her faith. With elegant prose, Teresa described her deafness as a silent castle, where she could find sanctuary from the clamour of the world and commune more closely with God. Her radical message of acceptance and self-love in the face of adversity resonated widely in an age when disability was viewed with fear and revulsion. Teresa became a celebrated figure, earning the respect of scholars and clergy across Spain. Her beautifully written works not only challenged prevailing attitudes, but proved that the deaf and disabled had just as much to contribute to religious discourse as the able-bodied. Teresa wasn't the only disabled individual to make waves in the medieval literary world. John Audible, a 15th century English poet and priest, composed a great deal of his most famous work after going blind later in life. In poems like Counsel in Contemplation, Audible reflects movingly on his experience of blindness and its impact on his spirituality. For blindness, Lord, is a wise counsellor. It makes a man think on his last end. With lines like these, Audible captures the profound insights that can come from grappling with disability and demonstrates the capacity for the blind to create great art. His influence can be seen in later English poets like John Milton, who also contended with loss of vision. Of course, not all disabled people in the Middle Ages had the privilege of nobility or the clergy. For the vast majority, their impairments meant a life of grinding poverty, begging on the streets for scraps. But even among the lowliest social classes, there are accounts of remarkable resilience and ingenuity. Records survive of blind and deaf tradespeople who found clever ways to ply their crafts. A 1389 document from the city of York describes a blind ropemaker who ordered his workshop such that he might find the material and tools for his trade by feel alone. Surviving sketches depict one-handed woodworkers using specialized vices and supports to carve and whittle. These enterprising artisans serve as a powerful reminder that disabled people throughout history have always found ways to adapt, create, and contribute to their communities despite the barriers in their way. And while these individuals were very much the exception in the Middle Ages, their stories foreshadow the assistive technologies and accommodations that would emerge centuries later. Slowly but surely, as the Middle Ages progressed, perspectives on disability began to evolve, catalyzed by seismic social and religious upheavals. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, left a huge number of people disabled or disfigured. With so many affected, disabilities became harder to dismiss as curses or divine punishments. At the same time, the rise of universities and a new emphasis on empirical observation prompted a more scientific understanding of disability. Physicians and scholars began to study physical and mental impairments as medical conditions rather than spiritual afflictions. These gradual shifts in perspective sowed the seeds for more tangible progress in the treatment and care of disabled people. The late Middle Ages saw a proliferation of hospitals and almshouses, charitable institutions that took in the sick, disabled, and indigent. While conditions in these early care facilities were often grim, they represented a crucial first step toward providing organized support for some of society's most vulnerable members. One of the most influential forerunners of these institutions was the Hôtel Dieu in Paris. Originally established in the 7th century, it underwent a significant expansion in the 14th century to accommodate the growing ranks of the disabled and destitute. With over 450 beds, it was one of the largest hospitals in medieval Europe, treating thousands of patients each year. Surviving records paint a vivid picture of life inside the Hôtel Dieu's wards. Beds were crammed close together and often shared by multiple patients. The air hung heavy with the stench of sickness and decay. But for those with nowhere else to turn, it provided a roof over their heads and basic medical attention, luxuries that would have been unthinkable for most disabled people just a few centuries earlier. Among the hospital's most famous residents was Louis de Courbet, a 14th century scholar who developed a debilitating skin condition that left him bedridden for years. Despite his physical limitations, Louis continued his academic work from within the Hôtel Dieu, penning theological treatises and commentaries. In many ways, Louis's story encapsulates the slow but significant changes in the perception and treatment of disability that began to take root in the late Middle Ages. While the prevailing attitudes remained overwhelmingly negative, there were glimmers of a more compassionate, person-centered approach. Society began to recognize, in small but meaningful ways, that those with disabilities had inherent worth and potential. Of course, this progress was halting and uneven. For every Louis de Courbet, there were countless other disabled individuals who continued to suffer in silence and obscurity. True equality and inclusion would remain centuries away. But the late Middle Ages planted the first seeds of the disability rights movement that would take shape many generations later. As we come to the end of our journey through this fascinating and often heart-wrenching chapter of human history, it's worth reflecting on how far we've come in our attitudes toward disability, and how far we still have to go. The individuals we've met along the way, from the intrepid Teresa de Cartagena to the enterprising blind tradesman, embody the resilience and indomitable spirit of disabled people throughout the ages. They serve as a powerful reminder that no matter the obstacles, the human drive to adapt, create, and contribute can never be fully extinguished. At the same time, their stories throw into stark relief the immense barriers and prejudices that disabled people have had to contend with throughout history. The stigma, the lack of accommodations, the social and economic marginalization, these are struggles that, in many ways, persist to the present day. But in grappling with this difficult history, we can find both inspiration and instruction for the road ahead. By amplifying the voices and experiences of disabled people across time, we honor their struggles and sacrifices. And in their triumphs over adversity, we find a roadmap for building a more just and inclusive world. A world where disability is seen not as a curse or a burden, but as a natural part of the beautiful diversity of the human experience. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complex and often painful history of disability in the Middle Ages. I hope this exploration has given you a deeper appreciation for the resilience and contributions of disabled people throughout the ages, and a renewed commitment to the work of disability justice in our own time. As we close, I'll leave you with the wise words of Teresa de Cartagena, who saw in her deafness not a prison, but a portal to the divine. The natural revelation of my deafness I accept and affirm as a spiritual consolation, a silent dwelling where I can find peace in my solitude and contemplation. May we all strive to create a world where disabled people can find such peace and affirmation, not in spite of their differences, but in celebration of them. Thank you for listening, and pleasant dreams.